Funding for this podcast is provided in part by the IPM Network through the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture and by various commodity groups through checkoff dollars, including the United Soybean Board, National Corn Growers Association, and Cotton Incorporated.
The ICDeadPlants podcast shares the stories of people and plants, pests and pathogens, and the conflicts among them. Join us as we speak to the folks who attempt to solve complex problems with plants through pest management research. ICDeadPlants is an extension-based podcast created by the Crop Protection Network and the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center and hosted by Ed Zaworski.
Welcome back to the ICDeadPlants podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ed Zaworski. Today, we are talking insects, specifically the Dectes stem borer of soybeans, and I've got Adam Varenhorst of South Dakota State with me. How you doing, Adam?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I am doing great. It's a wonderful Monday, and I'm always happy to record a podcast. So just a little bit of background on Adam. He got his bachelor's at Briarcliff University in biology, then went on to study entomology to get his master's and PhD here at Iowa State University, and he's currently an associate professor of entomology at South Dakota State, and he directs the South Dakota IPM program, or Integrated Pest Management. All sound about right to you, Adam?
Yep, and that director, I put that on my CV, but that's a title I gave myself. It's not recognized, but by the university, but it's kind of a nice way to remind myself I'm in charge of that grant and that project. So, but yeah, we try to do a lot of IPM related work here in South Dakota, and that grant is really, really foundational to all the work we do.
And then, Adam, I like to ask some kind of get to know you questions before we jump into the actual content material. So, first question I have for you: how did you become interested in entomology? It looks kind of like you made a jump from just general biology to entomology. What was the spark?
It's kind of a crazy story, and I'm sure there's a lot of people though that have similar ones. But I started at Briarcliff. I didn't even want to go to college, Ed. I wanted to farm.
Yeah.
And I was kind of given a push by my father because I grew up on a small farm, and a lot of long conversations, and it was kind of decided that our farm probably couldn't sustain two families on it. So I figured, well, I'll go get an undergraduate degree. I don't know what I want to do with it. And then was kind of looking at, going into a pre-pharmacy or pre-medical program. And one of the issues I was running into is you don't get to be outside very much in any of those jobs. And I took one entomology course, and it was, kind of one of those Cinderella stories because it was the only course taught at Briarcliff on entomology. And I took it, and, that it kind of sounds cliche, but the light clicked on 100% because taking this class and all of a sudden everything's making sense. And I'm doing excellent in this class. And, the professor took me aside, and he suggested maybe I have a future in entomology, and I never looked back. I just kind of went full speed into it, and connected with Matt O'Neill at Iowa State University, and I was fortunate that he brought me on for a master's degree. And then after completing that, he, I guess, decided he could tolerate me for a few more years and kept me on for a PhD in his lab. And hopefully he has no regrets looking back on all those decisions he made. But it's one of those things where it's incredible how fast time moves, and then once the puzzle pieces start falling into place, it happens really quickly. And I'm 10 years here at SDSU now, which is hard to believe too, but time goes fast, and I'm still very happy with my decision because this is probably one of the few careers that I still get to be heavily involved with agriculture. I'm not on the farm myself, but I'm helping out farmers on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure you understand that because your job is very similar in terms of that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. It's making me think about my own career, though, too. You mentioned you've been there for about 10 years, and I was laughing because you and I kind of went out into the world about the same time you finished your PhD and I finished my master's. And so now I'm thinking about
Yeah,
that
I'm
as
pretty
well.
sure we crossed paths, I think, at least once or twice at Iowa State. I was, tagging along with somebody and we went through the diagnostic lab, and I'm pretty sure you were just starting about that time, or we're finishing up your degree, I think. And so, but that's been quite a few years ago now. So
Yeah, that was back before multiple building changes and the good old days.
yeah, it's hard to believe. I was down to Ames, and it's already been quite a few years, and the insectary was gone, and pathology, entomology are in a new building, and it's just progress, I guess.
Yeah.
Things move forward, and and in some regards, too bad the insectary was one of those places where it was a very unique building, and a lot of history there, but unfortunately, it did have a lot of potential for expansion. So
Right.
I can understand why the administrators made those decisions. So
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I wanted to ask you, Adam, is just, it's a question that I don't think I've asked a lot, if at all, before, but I'm kind of curious maybe to start inserting this into my rotation. Like, what's something that you care about outside of your field? Like, what's something you're passionate about outside of entomology and agriculture?
that's a I that's a good question. You kind of got me, because I was thinking about that today, and it's one of those things where when you like what you do, you kind of put a lot of your time and energy into it.
Yeah.
And just thinking about my personal life, some aspects that I'm pretty pretty passionate about. One would be gardening.
Yeah.
We all need an outlet, something to give us that outlet for when we need to de-stress. And during the summer months, mine's gardening, and then that turns into I'm getting older and probably don't have any business eating this type of food anymore, but I like to make spicy salsas. And the spicier the better. And I've had my run-ins with certain kinds of peppers that I don't grow anymore. Uh, you've never experienced real pain, I guess, until you accidentally have a ghost pepper or something along those lines dissolve in your sink when you're not paying attention, when you're washing
Oh my
produce, and all of a
gosh.
sudden you reach in and can't figure out why your hands feel like they're on fire. But uh, you know, the gardening thing though is a great outlet, because and it still ties into entomology, but I like to think it's a different, because those are uh, different types of insect pests in some regards. Some of them cross over. It's unbelievable between the ag and the urban landscapes, and you get some of the same insects. Like, you wouldn't think about it, but corn earworm
Yeah.
are a pest of tomatoes, and think about them being an issue for corn, and then in the fall you start seeing your tomatoes with these giant holes and there's a big caterpillar in them. But that would probably be one of my outside. And then just trying to enjoy life's pretty short, so enjoy each day, I guess.
I'm curious, Adam, with gardening as an entomologist. I know, you know, my wife and I actually moved a couple of years, and we haven't had a garden since. But 2026, I think we're bringing it back. But I'm just curious. When I had a big garden as a pathologist, I found myself being excited about the diseases and insects, pests that were showing up in my garden rather than, like I never had like a woeful moment where I was like, oh no, like I was excited to see this stuff. Like, I don't know. How do you feel about it? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way, Ed. And the only time I get frustrated is when my four-legged friends. I have a lot of rabbit pressure, so
Ah,
that's not exciting, because I
no.
know what those are. But I'd say over the last few years, I've seen insect pests that I wouldn't have encountered unless I had certain garden plants. And there's asparagus beetles, and there's a particular beetle that attacks tomatillos. And I mean, it's so odd that we don't really encounter these until you put the. I'm sure you run into this with your diseases too, which the diseases I don't get excited about. I've had some issues the last few years. I have a very wet garden. It's in a low spot, and I seem to have my own issues with diseases, typically more than the insects. But it's still, that's exciting too, because it's kind of trying to troubleshoot. Then what did I do? and my lack of wisdom that caused this disease to become such a rampant issue, or was it a varietal issue? So, sometimes I think we have too much experience and knowledge because we start trying to tease apart exactly what caused it instead of just figuring, well, we got an insect pest or disease. But, I like to use some of that. It's not really in my role, but I like to write extension articles on some of these garden pests too. And I have a colleague who does the urban entomology and focuses on garden related insects. And I try to help out. And, I guess another big passion of mine would be photography. And
Ah,
it seems like it's harder and harder these days to get time to go out and take pictures. But, uh, that's one of the best ways we can, in extension, to really do our job well in some cases, is to take really good pictures, because the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you get a good picture of an insect pest or disease, it really helps people with identification. So
yeah,
that's one of those outside areas. It all feeds back though into the job in some way.
sure.
So,
There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good call out though about taking good pictures. I think I, I think everybody in their perspective field or respective field, sorry, that's a good reminder. Take some photos of what you're doing. You never know when it might come in handy. And in this line of work, it turns out all the time it would come in handy, like you said.
yeah,
So
that's one of my first two things I tell my students when they start their degrees. Is the first one is get started on your literature review, because it always seems like the sooner you do that, the better off you are, and you just have more knowledge on your project. And the second one is take all the pictures you can of your project, because,
mm,
and you went through a degree program too. A lot of us have, and you give a lot of presentations, and you have to typically give a presentation to defend at the end of your program. And you took really nice pictures along the way. It really helps. Tells the story, and you sometimes can tell a better story because of
and there's absolutely no excuse now. I think I hate to age myself, but I think when I started my master's, we were, you could probably relate to this too, Adam. We were kind of on the cusp of having a really good camera in our pocket at all times in our cell phones. I think at that time, cell phones were capable of taking pictures, but it wasn't something that I was going to show off to anybody. But now there's
it.
no
Yeah,
excuse.
it's funny. I was doing some cleanup this winter, I guess last winter now, and I came across my phone that I had in grad school. I saved it for one reason or another, had it in a box and came across it, and I looked at it in 2 megapixel camera. And
Yeah,
so, now our cameras are as good as our DSLRs, and it's unbelievable how much cell phones have changed. But it's true. And this even goes into when I'm visiting with stakeholders. I often will tell them, take as many pictures as you can of what you're trying to tell me,
hmm,
because unfortunately a lot of times we don't have an opportunity to travel. Or, and the case of me in South Dakota, I'm on the far eastern side of the state. So
sure.
somebody in central or western South Dakota, depending on where they're located, it might be an 8-hour drive to get there. So cell phones have really changed even the extension game a lot. And uh, it's incredible how much easier it's made. I can't imagine what our predecessors went through, because they would have had to either go off of a verbal description of what was going on, or actually get in the car and travel out to see what was going on. And times and technology have really changed, and I think some of it's been good, and some of it,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we don't get those contact, that face-to-face interactions we used to. But I think we can be a lot more helpful faster. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah. And you're a diagnostician's best friend, as you said, when you're
Yeah.
encouraging people to take more photos. Well, thanks for letting us learn little bit about you, Adam. Let's jump into the topic at hand. I was looking around for somebody to talk to about Dectes stem borer. I landed on Adam, so we're going to be talking about this insect that's, what would you say, rising in importance within soybeans.
That's a good way to put it. It's incredible. I was looking back in my notes for when we started getting reports, and it seems like I started here at SDSU in 2015, and I'd get maybe one or two reports of a small patch in a field uh, that had lodged a little bit, not real severe, but in some cases, we would check and it would be a little infestation of Dectes stem borer, which you go through the literature, there's been a lot of work done on Dectes and soybean, and that's kind of how things go. It's a sporadic, for the most part, it's a sporadic pest until you get further south, and when you get into Kansas, it seems like all of a sudden it's a much bigger issue a lot of times. And it's one of those pests though that for a long time in South Dakota was more or less under the radar. At some point around 2017 is when it really seems like things changed. And try as we might, we haven't quite pinpointed what really happened because, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, maybe it's because we have more no-till acres, or maybe it's because soybean acres. But when we look at the changes across time, we've been pretty steady. There was a big increase a few years, about 10, 15 years before we started seeing a lot in terms of no-till adoption, but a lot of work shown that no-till isn't just necessarily a guarantee to get Dectes infestations. And it's really important that we bring that up because a lot of times when we go to an infested field, the first reaction is, well, I think I'm going to till the field back up. And although there's some evidence that you can get some mortality in the winter by disrupting those overwintering larvae, it's not going to be a silver bullet by any means. And so
Sure.
we have to look at kind of a bigger picture in terms of how to manage it. And that, and we just don't have a good explanation. And going back in time, if we look at kind of the Dectes stem borer as a whole, it's kind of a theme with it because back in the late 1960s, it did a host transition from sunflowers to soybean. And, that even one of the researchers from Kansas State University who's done a lot of work on Dectes stem borer pretty much, gave a list of options for why this change might have happened in terms of host transition. And there's just nothing that really answers all of the components except that, my favorite explanation he provided was that soybean acres were predominant. And as a result, the Dectes stem borer, we don't know exactly how far they can fly. There's been one study that's in a thesis that looks at they did catch and release and then did markers and monitored how far they flew. But in terms of just absolutely figuring out how far they can fly, we don't have any data on that. And there's a chance they can fly pretty far, but they're kind of lazy when you see them out in the field. They're not necessarily one of the insects that wants to fly around a lot. And, it might just be an issue. The soybean field, they emerged, the soybean field was there. And the adults that came out at that point were kind of in the, willing to just take a chance. And soybean ended up being a moderate host. It's not the best host for them.
Sure.
But they can have a life cycle successfully completed in it. And some of the other hosts include sunflower. Cultivated sunflower is their favorite host. And then, we get into some of the weeds that we have in, Iowa and the Midwest, South Dakota, that they use. It would be cockleburr, common ragweed, and giant ragweed. And so there's been some discussions also of maybe increased weed pressure of some of these weedy hosts might have led to it. But, the contrasting argument on that is, well, if the weed pressure is higher and that's building the Dectes pressure up, why are we seeing so many in soybean? So it doesn't necessarily explain it really well. And, wild sunflower aren't actually a favorite host. They actually will avoid them in some cases if they can, because it just has host plant defenses that aren't really ideal. It produces more resins. It's a little tougher. So it isn't as nice of a host, but that opens up our sunflower that we produce here in South Dakota in the U.S. We didn't do most of the breeding to develop those hybrids. That was done in Europe, and so they didn't have the native hosts, the native pests for the native host, and so they had other things. They were working on the agronomic traits, and then we brought it back, and all of a sudden, all of these native pests are just very happy because it's really susceptible host plant. So
yeah, the proverbial jackpot.
Have you ever wondered how much yield you lost in past years due to pest and pathogen issues? Now you can access expert estimates using the CPN Field Crop Disease and Insect Loss Calculator. Just enter the crop, year, and diseases you saw in the field and your location.
I want to take a step back here really quick because I don't know a lot about agriculture in South Dakota. So I was going to see, would you be able to give the listeners what is the agricultural landscape of South Dakota like? What are the major crops? Where are they located? That kind of stuff.
Sure. That's a great question. And in South Dakota, our number one crop is actually rangeland. We have about 25 million acres of rangeland in South Dakota. And then going down from there, our next largest crop would be corn, then soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, and then we have a lot of smaller commodities. So we have sunflower, which includes both the oil and confectionery hybrids, and then field peas. I mean, South Dakota is, we don't grow quite as many crops, I don't think, as North Dakota. They have a few more that they include than we do, but we do have quite a few crops grown here in the state. And most of our sunflower production is in central South Dakota. So if you look along the Missouri River, it's an arid area. We don't get a lot of rain, and sunflowers are really well adapted. They have a taproot that really takes advantage of soil moisture. Kind of the catch there is then we have to have long-term rotations out there. And corn, since I've started here in South Dakota, corn and soybeans have become much more prevalent in those areas than they were in the past. And so, just driving when we do survey work, it's unbelievable. It used to be you'd see wheat fields and sunflower fields and occasionally cornfields. I mean, now when you're heading west, it's a lot more observation of corn and soybean. And we're actually also seeing an uptick of sorghum. I mean, it's one of those. We're one of those states where diversity is our friend in terms of crop production, because from year to year you just need some options.
Sure.
And so soybeans are pretty much now grown from north to south, all the way to the Missouri River, and in some cases have made it past the Missouri River. And sunflowers also go further west to pretty much all the way to our western border. However, it gets kind of spotty as you go west. A lot of those acres are in areas where they have pivots and have a way to provide additional moisture than just the lack of rainfall in some cases. But our probably some of our heaviest production areas are, in the southeast for soybeans, and that's also where we're seeing the heaviest pressure from the Dectes stem borer. And so, since we have sunflower in the state, we also have a lot of Dectes stem borer pressure in sunflower in the central part of the state. But it's pretty nice in terms of pest pressure, because as long as you have a sunflower field essentially in a neighborhood, the soybeans won't get infested. Because sunflower is so much more preferred. There's actually been research that's shown that you can use sunflower as a trap crop around a field edge, and it'll draw all of the Dectes stem borer in. But the catch there is, agriculture is pretty intensified. Nobody really wants to have a waste spot in the field for trap crops.
Sure.
But no, that's kind of our picture. And a lot of those other smaller crops are grown in the central part of the state. And we just did a wheat survey a couple years ago, and we were shocked. We were able to find a wheat field in every single county in South Dakota, even in the southeast part of the state. Counties that are bordering Iowa and Nebraska, and we were able to track down a field. So maybe not a lot of fields, but there was a little bit here and there. So
gotcha.
I guess that's one of our strengths here in the state, is that our farmers are not afraid to have diversified rotations. And unfortunately, it's not solving all of our pest problems. We wish it would.
So, Adam, the Dectes stem borer itself, what is it? What kind of insect is it? How does it? How does it affect soybeans and sunflowers? That kind of stuff.
Sure. So the Dectes stem borer, its species is Dectes texanus, and then the recognize common names, Dectes stem borer, but it's a longhorn beetle. So it's in the family Cerambycidae, and uh, it pretty much is one of the easiest beetles or insects that we have in agriculture to identify
Hmm.
because it's a medium to large size gray beetle, but the antennae are almost 2 times as long as its body, and they typically
Mm.
have those kind of at rest or forward, and so you have these long black and gray antennae on a gray beetle. Sometimes it does get misidentified. There are some blister beetles. The
Mm.
ash gray blister beetle is pretty close in color and size, but it has really short antenna.
Gotcha.
And so, that's the one incidents where we occasionally get some uh, misidentification, but long antenna really make it easier. And the adults emerge in the spring, typically in sometime when it starts warming up in June, and then they continue emerging pretty much until the end of July to August, depending on the season. And in South Dakota, we get such variation with our spring conditions. So one year we might have emergence in late May. If the
Mm.
spring warms up, and reverses, we might have snow in May, and so then we're a little later. So uh, it's kind of difficult to say that we have a really normalized emergence timing, but kind of use that as our estimate for when we should be out scouting. And uh, they start emerging as adults from the previous year stubble, so either
Ah,
soybean or sunflower stems. That's where the adults will be emerging from. The larvae actually overwinter and pupate in the spring, and then the adults immediately begin seeking out the new host.
gotcha.
And so as soon as they find it, they mate, and then the females will start targeting in soybean the upper canopy of the plants, and they'll lay eggs in the petioles, and then once the eggs hatch, the larvae start tunneling through the petiole to the main stem, and that's kind of the start of it. And it's kind of difficult because we also have another pest now in the same area that causes plants to wilt. Because prior, you
Mm.
could say look for wilting leaves on the upper canopy, and that might be an indicator of drooping or wilting leaves, and that you have a Dectes infestation occurring, or some a population that's trying to infest the soybeans. And now we also have the soybean gall midge, which causes plants
Ah,
to wilt. About the same time we start getting issues with that. But that's whole plant wilting and not just a few petioles. So,
gotcha.
and then those larvae of the Dectes stem borer will get into the main stem, and they start traveling up and down, feeding on the pith. And as we get closer to the end of the season, they move down to the base of the plant where they create their a little overwintering chamber right at to below the soil line in the
Mm.
stem. And the last step there is they girdle the stem. So girdling just means that they essentially saw around the stem. They leave a little tiny part of it alone. It almost looks like a thread on the plants that we've seen. And the whole idea with that, they don't want the plant to fall over right away. They want to create their little overwintering chamber and close it up. But their goal is that, and it's a really neat evolutionary adaptation because they're hoping that snow or wind's going to tip that plant over. And then after they pupate in the spring, the adults can literally just chew out a little plug
Mm.
that they created from their waste materials and the sawdust they create when they're chewing the stem, and emerge. And so they don't have to chew through an entire plant. They just essentially have a really easy out the plant exit. And you can imagine, though, with that kind of activity, they cause a lot of lodging. And then in soybean, the Dectes stem borer also just causes yield loss because it's a smaller plant. In sunflower, it causes negligible yield loss just from that up and down feeding in the pith. In soybeans, though, it can cause somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. Depends on the year, depends on if there's other environmental conditions, but uh, kind of a little, it's an interesting insect. I know for the farmers, they're not fond of it, but when we were doing our studies the first year, we were out trying to figure out if our plots actually had a good infestation. We were looking in the fall, and you could actually see little sawdust piles of the stem around
Mm.
the base of the plants for the ones that were infested because they girdled, and so that dust has to go somewhere, and it kind of exits the plant. But uh, so yeah, that's kind of, I think, a really quick summary of the insect. And It's a native insect, and it's one of those that's just been adapted. And that whole shift to soybeans is really interesting, and the fact that they use it so well. But
Yeah. Yeah.
but
It's
yeah, here in South Dakota, definitely one of those pests it's kind of reared its head, and we're not happy about it.
sure. Yeah. It's really interesting to me that it's transitioned to soybean, and it sounds like its life cycle is well suited for, it's crazy to me that an insect that, I don't know, its primary preferred host isn't soybean, but it moves so well up and down the plant to the point where it's, like you said, it's making a little chamber down at the base of the plant. Does it in general do that? Does it have the same behavior for all of the hosts that it might inhabit? Interesting.
It does. And so it's really interesting that it has the pretty much identical behavior. One of the interesting things is soybeans actually, out of the host, soybean, I think, if I remember correctly, is more similar to ragweed in terms of quality as a host. And so uh, there's some conflicting stories on in the research that's been done, and some of this research dates back to the 1960s, 70s, and we can't really talk to those researchers about it. But there's a little evidence in the literature that there's a different number of instars, even so the larval
Mm,
growth stages between the different hosts, and that really indicates. And then the size, and if you look at a Dectes that emerges from soybean versus one that's from sunflower, there's a very different size between the adults and the larvae. And it's just really fascinating that it's been able to adapt and use soybean. But essentially, it's like if you went on a crash course diet, it's
yeah.
not real healthy for you, but you're going to survive, and you're not going to thrive as much as if you're eating, at a buffet. But uh, you can make do, and so that's kind of how they are in soybean. And what we're seeing though is that the populations in soybean, it's a good enough host that populations do ramp up,
Mm,
and so that's what we're currently seeing. Is I don't know, based on my estimate, things started around 2017, and so we're 8 years into this ramp up, and it doesn't seem like we're slowing down
mm,
really. It seems like maybe since about 2021 we're increasing in terms of speed. But because back in 2017 it was still pretty low infestations. Around 2021 was when I sent my uh, one employee down to a field. I had some other meetings that day, and he called me up in the afternoon. He goes, "There's a problem here. I need you to know that we have a problem." And he sent me some pictures, and he looked at probably 1,000 plants, and 99% were infested.
mm.
And
Oh, wow.
that's that's when we started going, okay, this is maybe getting to be more of a problem. And then our research on it really started in 2023. So we were still kind of teasing things out in 2022, and started recording and reaching out to farmers in the areas and finding out just how bad the issue was, and move forward in 2023 with some research. But it seemed like it started out as kind of a hot spot, where it was
Mm,
really bad down around Yankton County, and then we thought maybe it was just in that area and had spread. But a recent student of mine, one of his projects was doing a survey and looking at soybean fields across eastern South Dakota, and we found it up in north, uh, the northeast part of the state,
mm.
fairly far north, and areas. I was, at the time, I was kind of asking, why are you even bothered surveying up here? We didn't find anything the year before. Focus year, and then he found some, and it was one of those times where I just sat there and was like, all right, maybe we need to intensify our surveying further north, because it seems like it's in more areas than we thought, just lower levels. So uh, sometimes it's good to let your students do the work, and just watch instead of micromanaging. Just
Yeah.
sometimes they have good ideas. So no, it's one of those pests though. Typically we kind of see the hot spots, and this one had a hot spot, and hopefully his study on that gets published. It was accepted, and we're just waiting for the journal to publish now. And one of the things we saw though were that there are some areas in southeast South Dakota that he would do 100 sweeps per field, and he was coming out of the field with 50 to 100 of these adults.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the kind of interesting things is a research study that was done back in around 2010, 2011 determined that adult populations are a terrible indicator for how bad the infestations are. And
Interesting.
typically, the infestations can be a lot worse than the adult populations indicate. And so it's kind of interesting because we might have a lot worse infestations in some of those areas than what's even being recognized. And I'm not sure if you run into this with diseases, but the Dectes stem borer is one of those. It's kind of asymptomatic through the year, because if you miss those petioles that are wilting and dying, you might not know you have an issue until it lodges in the fall.
Yep.
The plants are going to look fairly healthy. You'll have a little yield decrease, but all of a sudden in the fall, if we have a weather event, it's going to be lodged. 50 to 60% of your plants are going to be flat. So
sure,
it's kind of one of those surprise insect pests, and because it's so hard to find it, I kind of have a feeling that a lot of acres are affected, and we just haven't even recognized those yet.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like, it sounds a little bit like soybean cyst nematode on the disease side, on the pathogen side, like in that you can have those early season non-symptoms showing up, except SCN, you really don't notice it until you get to the grain bin and you get to the yield. But with this, it sounds like you might not notice it early, but then later you see wilting or dead plants and lodging, and there's indications later.
Yeah, and a lot of these plants that we sample at the end of the season to see if they have the Dectes larvae inside them or evidence of tunneling, you won't be able to tell a difference, the structure and, more or less from what we're able to discern. They look really similar. It's the seed weight's going to be lower or they're going to be flat.
Sure.
And it's really difficult. And we've been called out to fields that, where the damage was, the lodging was being blamed on another insect, and we'd be walking along. And the one nice thing with the Dectes stem borer is you can still observe infestations after harvest, because you can walk along and look at the soybean stubble, and you can actually tell if there's a frass plug or not, because the frass plug will, cover up the otherwise empty pith, where, it should be a straight down into the soil. And if the Dectes is present, you can just walk along and essentially count stubble for how bad the infestation was. So, but it definitely still is one of those that we're trying to increase our efforts on explaining the problem, because we do think there's more acres and more area being affected. And I know that I'm on a multi-state project. So after we were wrapping up our work, we started a multi-state project here in 2025 with, I believe it's Iowa. Trying to remember all the states that are on that project. At least Iowa, South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, and I believe, maybe a few states that are a little further off in the north central region. But so, even Iowa had some populations of Dectes stem borer here in 2025. I know Aaron Hodson was working on that study. And so it's out there, and, maybe it's been a pest that's out there at low levels, and we just don't see it because it's kind of hard to find in some cases. And
sure.
The larvae are really hard to find unless you're splitting soybean stems.
So is that, you mentioned that multi-state study there. Is that pretty much the extent of the nationwide distribution of Dectes stem borer? Or?
So it's actually, that's just, a portion of it in the north central region. And Dectes is actually almost, it seems like, nationwide.
Okay.
So it goes up the East Coast, goes down into the southern part of the U.S.
Interesting.
I don't believe Florida had a report, but Texas does, in sunflower. And so the other thing is, because it's in two different crops, there was a survey done back in, I think it was 2007. And they looked at, they sent a mailer out and got responses, and whether it was a pest in sunflower, soybean. In some states it's both, and A lot of states, though, in that survey, it was soybean are recognized as it was present but not a pest. And it might be worth going back and you know having a survey like that redone, because uh, it's been a few years since 2007. Things have changed, and
Yeah.
we hear a lot about changes in the climate, and we have changes across the country in terms of crop acres, and it's possible that maybe it's become more of a pest in some areas than it was previously.
ICDeadPlants bridges the gap between plant science research and the impact it has on our daily lives. It is brought to you by the Crop Protection Network and the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center, which are both partially supported by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. For more information on today's topic or other pest management issues, check out our show notes, cropprotectionnetwork.org or ncipmc.org. Remember, this information is for entertainment purposes only. The statements made in this podcast should be interpreted within the limited context of the particular topics being discussed. Contact your state extension program for local information on pest management. For the full non-discrimination statement or for accommodation inquiries, go to cropprotectionnetwork.org/about. Music written and recorded by fellow plant pathologist Sean Toporek. Thank you for listening to ICDeadPlants.